So, do you ever go to fly your FPV drone, and when you get home and stabilize the footage, you realize it just looks kind of like garbage? It's got a lot of jello to it, and there's just something wrong. Well, in the last video, we talked about obeying the 180 rule. In this video, we're going to tell you to break that rule, because that rule is actually what is causing the jello in your FPV footage.
The entire intro sequence in this video was digitally stabilized. Every single clip was handheld or attached to an FPV drone or scooter. No gimbals or tripods were used. So to make the footage look good, we had to make some changes on our general rules in filmmaking. Usually you want to follow the old 180 shutter rule, which means if you're filming at 24 frames per second, you need to be at 1/50. That makes things look smooth and more quote-unquote cinematic. You can see the frames kind of blend together where they otherwise wouldn't. And following the 180 rule works quite well when you're using something, again, like a gimbal, because mechanical stabilization like this actually reframes the camera and keeps it stable in the natural world. There is no reframing in post, so the motion blur is natural, it's real. So you want to follow the 180 rule in those moments. If you're on a tripod, it's the same way, except you're locked off, so the scene has natural motion blur, which is what you're going to want. But if you're going to go into digital stabilization, you run into some problems. You'll get this jello effect when you follow the 180 rule. In the intro sequence, we filmed two versions of those GoPro clips. One where we follow the 180 rule, and you can see the jello and where the motion blur kind of falls apart when it's been stabilized. And then one where we break the 180 rule and actually go about 4 times the shutter speed. So instead of 1/50 for 24 frames per second, we did about 1/96 for 24 frames per second. And when you look at these clips, they're much better. You don't have the jello. Yes, there is less motion blur in a way that you would want it, but if you're going to digitally stabilize, you have to pick one or the other. And in this case, you want a little less motion blur. So anytime you're going to film with a GoPro, I would recommend you use at least 4 times the frame rate for your shutter speed, sometimes even more.
This doesn't only apply to GoPro footage, but also bigger cameras like our FX3. In this clip, we're actually obeying the 180 rule and using a slower shutter speed. But can you see the jello effect? That's because we're using a slower shutter speed. Here we're using a much faster shutter speed, which technically breaks that old 180 rule. But can you guys see how much cleaner the image is? There's none of that weird rubbery jello effect that you'd get otherwise. And this is all completely handheld. So some rules are just made to be broken.
Unlike mechanical stabilization, where it's actually moving your camera around, you're reframing in post. And for this reason, you need to make sure you film everything extra wide. If you're using horizon lock on a GoPro, then you're really going to want to be wide, because if your camera is sideways, you're going to need to reframe that entire clip. So make sure you're shooting extra wide and ideally at a very high resolution, like 5K or better if possible, because you're going to always be cropping in. The computer uses the gyro data from your camera or an external logger, or if you're using something like Warp Stabilizer, it just looks at the image and tries to reframe based on that. So if we look at these clips where we shot handheld on our FX3, you'll see how rough they are in the beginning. And then we go into the computer with the magic of Catalyst Browse, and it crops in. And see, we can actually set the percentage of crop that we want to use to make it more stable. The more crop you allow, the more stable the footage will look. So again, the wider you shoot, the more you will be able to stabilize in post. Ideally, you still want to be as smooth as possible, because if you are really smooth, you only need about a 90% crop versus a 60 or 70% crop. And that will always look much better. And given the option, always use mechanical stabilization if it works. Sometimes if you're doing run and gun, dealing with a gimbal is not really practical. Yeah, sure, you can carry it around, but you're thinking about a gimbal, you're thinking about all of its settings, but then you also have to think about your camera settings. You have to think about framing the shot. You have to think about creativity. And sometimes running more gear can actually ruin your creativity. So mechanical stabilization is best if you have the time to think it through and plan out your shots the way you want. A lot of cameras also have IBIS, and IBIS is not the same as like hypersmooth on a GoPro. IBIS actually moves the sensor around inside the camera, and that's the same as mechanical stabilization. It keeps the motion blur natural. It's not reframing the shot in post. The sensor just tries to follow you as you move. As far as software is concerned, there's several great options out there today. So for our Sony cameras, we use Catalyst Browse. It uses the gyro data right out of the camera, and you can just edit everything in post, and it's free. Another great option is GyroFlow. They have GyroFlow 1.0 now, which is their first big release. And it's totally open source and uses an external logger or the gyro data from your camera. This allows you to do things like stabilize a Blackmagic camera by strapping a GoPro to it and using the data from the GoPro. It's crazy. And then of course, there's RealSteady or RealSteady Go if you're using a GoPro. Clearly this GoPro needs to go back to Best Buy. It's taken a few hits. But RealSteady is really the OG of stabilization software. When it comes to GoPro and FPV footage, that's what everybody really wants to use. However, GyroFlow I think is changing the game and allowing us to use a lot more cameras when we fly FPV. And then you also have Warp Stabilizer in the case of Adobe Premiere, and there are several other stabilization options for different editing programs. But Warp Stabilizer actually just looks at the image and tries to kind of figure out what is supposed to be stable. I like to use it as a last resort, or sometimes after I've used some of these other programs, I'll add just a little bit more of Warp Stabilizer to level out the footage. But generally we try to avoid it because things can get really wobbly really fast. So remember, when you're filming with a GoPro or a mirrorless camera and you're going to use digital stabilization, always try to use 4 times your frame rate for your shutter speed. If you're going to film slow motion or 60 frames per second, you really don't need to go much over 1/200. That's kind of the max. Now, if you are using a longer lens, treat it like photography, so follow your focal length. If you're shooting on a 200mm lens and you're going to stabilize in post, I would use at least 1/200 for your shutter speed. In this clip, we use a 200mm with a 1/200 shutter speed, and this is handheld, and you can see it looks pretty smooth. So there are tools to bring motion blur back in if you want it in post. You can use things like After Effects, which is not a great workflow, but it will get that motion blur back if it is really important to you. However, if you have unintended motion blur or jello in your shots, there's no way to recover that. So always start with a sharper image when you're using digital stabilization. Well, hopefully this video helped you guys to get your footage a little bit better in your FPV shots and just your mirrorless shots as well. If you have any questions on why your footage is jumpy, check out this video on what frame rates to use and how to use them for slow motion, because that's a really common issue. Well, thanks again, guys, and we'll see you in the next video.